good to be with you. Thank you, Ari. As Ari said, last time we focused on the figure of Eliyahu in the Bible, and today we're going to make the transition from the Bible to his post-biblical career. And much of what we know about Elijah, when people have some memory of Elijah, it's not Elijah in the book of Kings. It's not Elijah as this zealot fighting and slaughtering the prophets of Baal. It's Elijah at the seder, or it's Elijah helping people, Elijah inspiring people. So how does that transition come about? This transition from the biblical figure, Eliyahu Hanavi, to the Elijah that we know and love and remember. I want to begin just by looking at a couple pictures here. This is actually the cover of my book, Becoming Elijah. It's an engraving by Gustave Doré in the 19th century. And it's, as you can guess, Elijah ascending to heaven. So we have Eliyahu up here at the top, and below we have Alicia. Alicia is the disciple of Elijah. Ari mentioned him a moment ago. So Alicia is gazing up at Eliyahu. Eliyahu is being carried away by this chariot of fire. You can see the horses of fire and chariot of fire. And we have clouds here, but this actually is not the cloud. This is Elijah's mantle, his aderet, his cloak, his mantle that he's dropping. And Alicia will catch it, will pick it up. And that's the transmission of authority, the transmission of the prophetic figure, the transmission of the prophetic quality from Elijah to Alicia. So it's a powerful image, a powerful event. This is the climax of the biblical story, what we ended with near the end of last week's session. One important thing here is that it's unclear whether this is Elijah's death or the beginning of his transformation, another step in his transformation. Is he being taken up to heaven, turned into an angel, or is he taken to heaven because his life has ended and his soul will be with God? In some way, Elijah will be with God, but he has died. So it's not clear. You remember that Alicia down here, Alicia tears his clothes. He rips his own clothes in mourning. So Alicia thinks that Elijah has died. I want to look at one other picture with you. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so we can look at a picture and instead of reading page after page. This is a totally different picture. I mean, very different picture. We still have Eliyahu. This is a story in the Bible that I did not have time to talk about last week. I want to mention it briefly now. It's one of the miracles of Elijah. And it's interesting, Elijah and his disciple Alicia, they are the only two figures in the Hebrew Bible who are especially known for their miracles. Okay, we have miracles performed by Moses, the miracles performed by other people, but Elijah and Alicia, that's their specialty. One of their specialties is miraculous action. And this is one of the first miracles in Elijah's life. The first miracle is when he runs away after declaring the drought. You remember he stays by a brook, the brook Chariot, and there he's fed miraculously by ravens. So that's a miracle that happens to Elijah. But then the creek dries up and Elijah has to find another place. And he's directed to find this woman, to meet this woman. This is a non-Israelite woman from the territory of Phoenicia, north of Israel on the Mediterranean coast, modern-day Lebanon. Elijah is instructed to go to that area and to find a woman there, a widow. He finds this widow, and the widow is basically on the verge of dying. She looks very healthy here with her child, but according to the book of Kings, the woman, the widow, and her little son are starving. They have no food. They have no resources. And Elijah miraculously provides them with food. She has a jug of oil and a jar of flour. And Elijah tells her that those will never run out. Okay, for the remainder of the drought, those will never run out. They'll be miraculously replenished. And then the little boy dies, and Elijah brings him back to life. Or maybe he's in a coma, he's either dies or he's on the verge of death. Elijah revives her child. This is at the early point in their encounter where she's explaining to Elijah, saying to her, what do you have? What do you have to eat? And the woman says, all we have is a little flour and a little oil. So their desperate need evokes his compassion. And you see here the compassionate side of Elijah. One of the things we're going to discuss today, the main thing we're going to discuss is the transformation of Elijah from the biblical zealot to the master of compassion. But it's important to recognize that already in the Bible itself, he is a compassionate figure. Here we see Elijah's compassion with the widow and her child. So I wanted to begin with those pictures. And now we're going to take a look at our text. The transition really, you could say, begins here. The quote from the prophet Malachi we discussed last week. This is around the year 500 BCE, so it's hundreds of years after Elijah has died or after he's left earth. And at the end of the prophet of Malachi says, look, I'm sending to you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the day of Yud He Vav He, great and awesome. Okay, it's on page 3 of the PDF. So Malachi predicts that Elijah will come back. God will send Elijah to announce the day of Yud He Vav He. You could say the day of Yud He Vav He is the end of history, the day of judgment. And for the rabbis of the Talmud and the Midrash, this means that Elijah will announce the coming of the Messiah. He will prepare the way for the Messiah. So that's already there. That's already hinted at in the Bible, and that becomes more prominent in the rabbinic literature. Let's take a look at an Elijah story. Okay, we've read about Elijah in the Bible. This is a story about Elijah, depicting him as a shapeshifter. Okay, some of you may think that term comes from Marvel Comics or movies about Transformers, superheroes. Elijah, in a way, is a Jewish superhero, but he's also a shapeshifter. This is actually a name from the study of religions. Shapeshifter is a figure in various mythologies, various mythological tales, various mythical tales, a figure who can take on different personalities, who can take on different forms, who can appear as different people. That is a shapeshifter, and Elijah can do that. That's one of his qualities. And here's a story explaining that. This is from the Talmud. One time Elijah made an appearance before the Roman emperor. He did so in the company of the sage Nahum of Gimzo, whose title is based on his town, located in the center of the land of Israel. Okay, that's a little introduction. That's not from the rabbinic source itself. So this figure, Nahum of Gimzo, in a pun on this place name, he's sometimes called Nahum of Gamzo. Gamzo means this too. Excuse me. And here's where the rabbinic passage begins. Why was he called Nahum of Gamzo? Because whatever happened to him, he would say, Gamzo l'tova. This too is for the best. Once the Jews wished to send a gift to the emperor. Okay, they were deciding to send somebody to Rome to gain favor with the current emperor. They said, who should go? Let Nahum of Gamzo go, for he is experienced in miracles. Okay, this rabbinic figure was known to be a miracle worker. They sent with him a chest full of jewels and pearls. He set out and he spent the night at a certain inn. During the night, the occupants of the inn arose and emptied the chest and filled it with earth. In the morning, when Nahum saw what had happened, he said, Gamzo l'tova, this too is for the good. When he reached his destination, they opened the chest and saw that it was full of earth. The king then wanted to kill all of them, all the Jewish emissaries or all the Jews, saying, the Jews are mocking me. Nahum said, Gamzo l'tova. Elijah came and appeared. So this is the phrase that we'll have a number of times in the Talmud and the Midrash. Elijah showed up. Okay, so clearly Elijah has not died. He's in heaven. waiting to help humanity. Elijah came and appeared before the emperor as one of his ministers. So Elijah takes on the shape of a Roman minister. He doesn't show up as Elijah. He shows up as a minister in the court. He said to the emperor, "Perhaps this is some of the earth of their father Abraham. For when Abraham threw earth against the enemy, it turned into swords. And when he threw stubble, it turned into arrows." Okay, this is magic dust, Elijah is saying. Now, there was a certain province that the Romans were unable to conquer. When they tried throwing some of this earth against that province, they conquered it. So they went into the royal treasury and filled Nahum's chest with jewels and pearls and sent him off with great honor. Okay, so Elijah is something of a trickster. He can perform miracles, he can turn into various people, and he somehow, he's standing up for his people. He's protecting the Jews in a risky world. Okay, the Jews have enemies, and Elijah is able to thwart the enemies of his people. Let's look at one other story here. Elijah, another example of Elijah as a shapeshifter. This is a story about Rabbi Meir, a famous figure in early rabbinic times, 2nd century. Meir had rescued his sister-in-law, who was condemned to slavery in a Roman brothel. Okay, and because of that, the Romans put up Meir's picture. They posted his wanted picture. And this is a very short account in the Talmud. They went and engraved Rabbi Meir's image at the entrance of Rome and proclaimed, "Anyone who sees this face, bring him." One day, some Roman officers saw him and ran after him. He ran away from them. Some say that Elijah appeared to the Roman pursuers as a prostitute and embraced Rabbi Meir. The pursuers said, "Heaven forbid, if this were Rabbi Meir, he wouldn't have done that." Thereby, he was saved. Thereby, Rabbi Meir was saved. Okay, so Elijah is able to do something totally unexpected, to do something that seems sinful, but it's for the purpose of saving his colleague, saving one of the rabbis. Okay, so Elijah has turned into a kind of super rabbi. He's a shapeshifter, he's a miracle worker, he's available to help people in distress, but he's in touch with the rabbis. He interacts with them. Let me pause here for just a minute or two, and Ari may have a question or take a question from the chat, and
Sure.
then we'll return to some of the texts.
I think, one of the questions was on shape-shifting, and you had mentioned it was like a theme in other literature. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And is that unique in our tradition to Elijah?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't think you find it about many other figures in Judaism. The term appears in the study of folk tales and folk legends and mythology, and there's certain figures in Norway was one of the places that I came across where you find this figure, but it's cross-cultural, and this is the Jewish version.
A similar question, you touched on it briefly about Elijah and Jesus and miracles. Do they perform basically, do the stories about Jesus kind of conform to the stories about Elijah when it comes to miracles? Is there an overlap of what Jesus does to what Elijah does to connect those two?
That's fascinating. The link between Jesus and Elijah is very significant. I'll answer your question first and then say a little bit more generally. The miracles in the New Testament, the miracles that are taught, that are relayed, that are transmitted about Jesus, they seem to be modeled on the miracles of Elijah and Alicia. Okay, for example, Elijah brings back to life the son of the widow, and Jesus brings back to life the son of a widow. Elijah feeds the widow miraculously, and Jesus feeds the masses miraculously. There it's different, but that account of Jesus is based on Alicia, because Alicia feeds many people miraculously. So Elijah and Alicia are both important models for Jesus. Ari, if I could ask you, there's some noise coming from the background. I think it's from your office. So maybe mute yourself or mute everybody, and then I'll.
No, for some reason someone unmuted, which I didn't allow them to. So Now it should, is it gone? Because nope.
I think it's from you, Ari. I think it's from your surrounding.
Then I will get caught.
No, it's not me. Someone else is talking. So, hey, would you guys, whoever's talking, will you just mute, please? Because there's a lot of people here, and I'm trying to find out who it is that's creating the ambient sound.
I think you. Ari, what I would suggest is
I got it. It's done.
But if it happens again, just mute all, and I'll unmute.
Okay, no, it's done.
Great.
Basically,
Okay.
I don't know why people are unmuting, but they should. They now are quiet. Okay, so a question Barbara Hoff came.
Wait, one second. I want to say something more about Jesus.
Go ahead. Jesus is always popular in our group.
Yeah. Now, why is Elijah so important for Jesus? Because you remember, Elijah is going to pave the way for the Mashiach, is going to announce the coming of the Mashiach. And that's really why in the New Testament, John the Baptist is Elijah. I think I mentioned this briefly last week, but it's very important. Jesus is actually asked about this, and Jesus says that John the Baptist is Elijah. And that's because John the Baptist will announce the coming of the Mashiach. But it's even more interesting than that, because Jesus seems to have thought of himself as a prophetic figure. And it's very likely that he thought of himself as Elijah, because Elijah can come back. Maybe Jesus thought that Elijah had now come back as Jesus. But in any case, that connection is very significant. I see a question popped up in the chat about the green one. That's the Islamic version of Elijah, a figure who's called the green one, the green man. He appears in Islamic tradition. He's alluded to, perhaps, in the Quran itself. Great. Let's go to another question or two, and then we'll go back to the
I have a few related questions. Barbara Hoff asks, who was the artist who made those the artwork that you use in your book, the cover and the front?
Yeah, so the cover, that picture of Elijah ascending to heaven, is Doré, D-O-R-E, Gustave Doré, the 19th century. And the picture of Elijah and the widow is an Italian artist, Strozzi, S-T-R-O-Z-Z-I, Bernardo Strozzi in the 17th century.
Then I see many questions about the chariot, and you and I talked briefly. Can you talk about the chariot and where else it appears in our text and the importance of that, and if it appears anywhere else in the biblical text? You know, we talked about Yechezkel,
right?
And then there's a related question about Muhammad going up into heaven in a chariot. I don't know if he went up in a chariot. I thought he.
Muhammad is in a chariot. Muhammad is just the horse. Elijah is the horse and the chariot. So that, chariots appear frequently because it was the main war,
like a car,
vehicle,
like a tank.
Yeah, for getting around and especially for battle. So it's an important image. You remember the crossing of the Red Sea, right? And the Egyptians and their chariots are thrown into the sea. So chariot is like a tank or a jet, a bomber. So it appears in that kind of earthly way. But what Ari is alluding to is really the two most important heavenly chariots. One is this one that takes Elijah up to heaven, and the other is, you remember, Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, has a vision of a heavenly chariot. It's not a chariot that goes up to heaven, it's a chariot that stays in heaven because it transports God in the heavens. It's the heavenly throne. It's a chariot throne. And that's Ezekiel's vision, the very first chapter of the prophet Ezekiel, a wild, dramatic, colorful, almost psychedelic vision of this heavenly chariot throne. So those are the two main thrones that come to mind when you're talking about an encounter with God or the major biblical figures. Ezekiel has the vision of the chariot. Elijah has his own journey in the chariot to heaven. Let's do one more question, and then we'll come back to the text.
I'm looking to see if there's any question that
would be
relevant now.
I can look at the chat too.
We have a general question of why Elijah became who he became, but that's really what you're talking about in general, and we'll get there.
We can just come back to that.
Yeah, I would say let's go to the text, and we'll come back with more questions.
Right. Let's explore a few more. Yeah, this is interesting. Number 3. It's now on page 4 of the PDF. Once in a certain Babylonian marketplace, this is my own paraphrase for the moment, Elijah revealed himself to Rabbi Baroka Choza'ah. Okay, and this is what Elijah does in the Talmud. He reveals himself to worthy individuals. He may study with them. He may answer a difficult question they may have. He may ask them a question. Sometimes Elijah is taught something by one of the rabbis. So he's not the person who knows absolutely everything, but he knows a lot because he moves back and forth between heaven and earth. He's really what I've mentioned in the book. He's the virtuoso of the in-between. I borrowed that phrase or stole that phrase, I believe, from Lawrence Hoffman, who's written on Elijah. So Elijah is the virtuoso of the in-between. He is able to communicate heavenly secrets. In fact, he is a participant in the Heavenly Academy, where God teaches the souls of the departed. Elijah knows what's happening there, and he reports it to earth. And sometimes he brings earthly information to the heavenly court. So he meets up with certain rabbis, sometimes once or twice, sometimes regularly, which means certain individuals in the Talmud and the Midrash have a relationship with Elijah, a close relationship. So this one rabbi, Rabbi Baroka, met Elijah and he asked him, is there anyone here who will reach the world to come? Is there someone here who will be gifted with the bliss and the blessings of life in the world to come? Elijah replied, no. Nobody here is going to make it to the world to come. Nobody here is virtuous enough to be given that gift. But after a while, two brothers came along whom the prophet identified as deserving of eternal bliss. And now comes the direct quote. Rabbi Baroka approached them and asked, what is your occupation? They replied, we are jesters. We cheer up the depressed. Also, when we see two people quarreling, we try hard to make peace between them. Okay, so this isn't Elijah, this is the jesters, but Elijah realizes that jesters are holy, that humor can be transformative, that bringing peace to the world is what it's all about. Elijah becomes the peacemaker. Elijah, who had been the zealot, and almost you could say the fanatic, now he tries to harmonize. Now he tries to pacify. Now he tries to bring shalom. And this, in fact, is the subject of the next quote. This is what will happen when Elijah comes. What will he actually do when the Messiah comes? When Elijah returns to herald the arrival of the Messiah, he will clarify halachic doubts, explain problematic verses in the Bible, and harmonize rabbinic disputes, thereby restoring peace. Okay, this is how he's going to bring shalom. He's going to solve disputes that weren't solved in the Talmud. If there's a halachic question that has not been decided, Elijah will be able to give information to provide the answer. So this is how it's worded. This is actually in the Mishnah, the earliest part of the Talmud. Rabbi Yoshua said, I've received a tradition from Rabban Yochanan, son of Zakkai, who heard from his teacher, and his teacher from his teacher, as a halacha, as a law, as a decision, as a piece of legislation given to Moses at Sinai. What was this tradition? That Elijah will not come to declare pure or impure. Elijah is not going to be involved in that kind of halachic decision making. Okay, is this piece of meat kosher? Is this item ritually permissible? Elijah isn't going to do that. Instead, Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Yochai, Elijah will come to harmonize disputes. Okay, he's not going to kill off the false prophets. He's not going to insist on his one interpretation. He's going to find a way to make peace. And the sages say to make peace in the world. As is said, look, I'm sending to you Elijah the prophet, and he will bring fathers' hearts back to children and children's hearts back to their fathers. So that prediction in Malachi now is seen as his messianic role, Elijah's messianic task. Number 5, if two people deposited money with a third, one of them depositing 100 silver coins, 100 zuz, the other 200 zuz, And afterward, one says the 200 is mine, and the other says the 200 is mine. They both claim that the 200 is theirs. The one holding the money should give each of them 100 zuz, and the rest must remain until Elijah comes. Okay, that's the phrase, ad sheyavo Eliyahu. That phrase appears a good number of times in rabbinic literature in this context, this kind of situation. We don't know who's telling the truth. We don't know the facts of the matter. Elijah will come and reveal what really happened. Elijah knows what is hidden, and that will help make final decisions possible. Now, what about when is he going to come? This, I think, I may have mentioned, Elijah's arrival date. Okay, Israel has already been assured that Elijah will not come on the eve of Shabbat. Elijah, we don't know exactly when he's going to come, but he's not going to come on Friday or on the eve of a festival due to the effort required to prepare for the holy day. It's really remarkable. In other words, Elijah won't come to announce the Messiah on Sabbath Eve, on Friday afternoon, because people are too busy preparing. As Rashi says, people would abandon the preparations and go to greet him. We don't want people to forget about Shabbat just because Elijah's coming. Okay, this is almost comical. The Messiah is about to come, but it's more important to prepare now for Shabbat than to prepare for what might happen, or even what's expected to happen. It's a remarkable example of rabbinic priorities. Do what matters here and now. Don't dream about Mashiach. Now Elijah and Pinchas. This is very interesting. I'm sure many of you know who Pinchas was. Some of you may not know who he was. Pinchas was the earlier zealot. Okay, Pinchas is the other famous zealot in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. Elijah, we've seen, defeats the prophets of Baal. Pinchas is one who stands up for the purity of Israel. He kills an Israelite who was fornicating with a Midianite princess. I think I mentioned briefly last time. So Pinchas is a zealot, and Elijah is a zealot. We have to remember, Pinchas lived in the time of the Torah, okay, in the time of Moses, let's say around 1200 BCE, 1150 BCE. Elijah lived in the 9th century, 870 BCE. Okay, so it's 300 years, probably something like 300 years between Pinchas and Eliyahu. They're far separated chronologically. But look at this little account here that we're going to look at, because what happens in Jewish tradition, not in the Bible, not explicitly in the Talmud or the Midrash, but it's kind of a hidden tradition that then becomes more widespread in the Middle Ages. There's a tradition that Elijah and Pinchas are one and the same person. Now, that's really impossible because, as I said, the chronology prohibits that. But there was a belief that Pinchas lived long enough that he actually became Elijah. Now, as we say, it's pretty unlikely that Pinchas lived for 300 years. On the other hand, you do find Pinchas mentioned after the Torah. Pinchas is named in the book of Judges as still officiating as a priest. So that makes it not so far-fetched to think, well, maybe he lived a little bit longer and he actually became Elijah. But what does this mean that Pinchas is Elijah? You could say it means that they share that psychological trait. Or you could think it means that Pinchas was reincarnated as Elijah. But it's simply saying Pinchas lived long enough to become Elijah. And here's an example of how that appears in rabbinic literature. Okay, the Blessed Holy One revealed himself to Elijah and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "Kano kineti, I have been so zealous for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant." Okay, that we saw in the book of Kings itself. This is the revelation of God to Elijah at Mount Sinai. And right, God says to Elijah, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah says, "I've been so zealous, but the people are destroying, or Jezebel and Ahab are destroying your altars, O God. They're killing your prophets." So Elijah claims that he is the zealot. Okay, here is the word, kano kineti, I have been so zealous. Now, this is a late midrash that's bringing this line from the book of Kings, and here's how the midrash goes on. The Blessed Holy One said to him, "You are always zealous. You were zealous in Shittim on account of sexual immorality, as is said, Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, turned away my wrath from the Israelites, b'kano et kinati, by zealously enacting my zeal in their midst. So I did not annihilate the Israelites by my zeal." So what is that saying in the book of Numbers? That's the account of Pinchas killing the Israelite and the Midianite princess because they were fornicating, engaged in a kind of orgiastic idol worship to Baal, to the same kind of God that Elijah is fighting hundreds of years later. That false god Baal was attractive to the Israelites already in the Torah. So Pinchas lashes out at that violator, at the member of an Israelite tribe and the foreigner he was fornicating with. But what this midrash is saying is that God says to Elijah, "You've always been zealous. You were zealous when you were Pinchas, and here too you are zealous." What's here too? In the book of Kings. So according to this midrash, Pinchas in the Torah and Elijah in the book of Kings are one and the same, and God is criticizing Elijah Pinchas, for being so zealous. So what does God say? By your life, Israel shall not enact the covenant of circumcision until you see it with your eyes. This is the origin of the belief that Elijah appears at a circumcision. At every traditional Jewish circumcision, at every very traditional Jewish circumcision, there is a chair for Elijah. There's a chair for Elijah to occupy because of this story. Elijah is so zealous that God says, "You're too zealous. You're so zealous that I want you to show up and see what? I want you to see that the children of Israel are keeping the covenant. They haven't rejected the covenant. They're keeping the covenant." What's the Hebrew word for covenant? Brit. Brit is bris. The circumcision is called Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision, or just Brit for short, or bris. So Elijah has to show up at the Brit, at the circumcision covenant, to show, to demonstrate that Israel does keep the covenant. You could say it's almost a punishment. God is punishing Elijah for being so zealous, saying you have to show up at every circumcision. Some people say, no, it's not a punishment, it's a reward. Because Elijah cares so much about the covenant, he gets to officiate at every circumcision. Okay, it's unclear. I think the simple meaning of this text is that God is saying to Elijah, you think the people have forsaken the covenant? No, I'm going to make you show up at every covenant, at every circumcision to see. But you could interpret it differently. As with so many of the Elijah stories, the interpretation is not so clear. We don't know whether Elijah died or not. Okay, we don't know exactly what God means when he says, what are you doing here? But Elijah responds by claiming that he's a zealot. Because of this, okay, because of this encounter between God and Elijah, the sages instituted the practice of preparing a seat of honor for the angel of the covenant. Okay, this is one of the names of Elijah. He's called Malach HaBrit, the angel of the covenant, as is said, and the angel of the covenant whom you desire, behold, he is coming. Where is this from? Malachi. Malachi chapter 3, the same book, the same chapter that says, I'm sending you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the day of Yud-Heh-Vaveh. He'll turn fathers' hearts back to children, children's hearts back to fathers. That same prophet, that same chapter mentions the angel of the covenant. Okay, in the book of Malachi, it's not clear that the angel of the covenant is Elijah. In fact, he's probably not Elijah. But for the rabbis and the Zohar, the angel of the covenant is one of Elijah's names. So this is a famous midrash. It comes from a source known as the Chapters of Rabbi Eliezer, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. And this is the origin of Elijah showing up at the circumcision. We'll talk about other places that Elijah shows up, the Seder and the Havdalah, in our final session. Let's look at a few more passages here.
Just
Sure.
to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
So this midrash is connecting the two figures because of the words bekano et kinati, because they appear in the two places, correct? And therefore that
yes.
gives them that pivot to connect the two.
Yes, I'm very glad you said that. I want to make that clear, right? So Elijah says, "Kano kineti," right? I have been so zealous. And Pinchas doesn't say it, but about Pinchas, about his act of, killing the sinners, God describes it and says, "Bikano et kinati," when he zealously enacted my zeal, by zealously enacting my zeal. So notice that root kinah, the root kano, kuf nun aleph, that comes twice here, right? And it comes twice here. It's the only time in the whole Bible that root comes twice. These two times, once with Elijah, once with Pinchas. You could say that proves that they are the ultimate zealots. They're doubly zealous. Yeah. Thank you, Ari. Okay, let's look at a few more short things, and then we'll leave some time for questions. Elijah and Alicia, okay? We've dedicated this session today to Alicia. Alicia and Elijah go together. People confuse them. Okay, but Elijah is the master, Alicia his disciple. Alicia captures, he catches that mantle, that aderet that Elijah drops as he's ascending to heaven. So remember, Alicia is mentioned for the first time when God says at Mount Horeb, Yud-Heh-Vav said to Elijah, "Go, return on your way, and Alicia, son of Shaphat, from Avel Mecholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place." Okay, that's what God says. Anoint him in your place. What does a midrash say? The wording "in your place" means, I do not want your prophesying. That's actually a line in the midrash. Okay, the rabbinic source says that God says to Elijah, I don't want you being a prophet any longer. Now, I want to make clear that's not what the Bible says, right? What does the Bible say? The Bible just says, anoint Alicia as prophet in your place. Okay, the Hebrew is tachtecha, beneath you, below you, but it means in your place. But the rabbis take this to mean replacing you because you're no longer fit to be a prophet. Okay, I don't want your prophesying. It's very strong language, even for a midrash. But this shows you the rabbinic dissatisfaction with Elijah's zealotry. Elijah is too zealous for the rabbis to handle. So they change him. They turn him into a compassionate figure. You could say they bring out his compassionate element, right, which is already there when he revives the dead or dying child. Elijah is compassionate, but his zeal takes over. And for the rabbis, they want a little less zeal and a little more loving kindness. So Elijah becomes more of a loving figure. You could say Elijah learns how to love. He learns how to express that compassion. Let's look at this number 9. It's a remarkable passage, also from the Midrash. This is from Tanchuma. Okay, page 6 of the PDF, number 9. The Blessed Holy One said, I revived the dead, and Elijah revived the dead. Okay, the child of the widow. I bring down rain, Elijah brought down rain. When did he bring down rain? When he ended the drought on Mount Carmel, right? He brings down fire. He prays to God to bring down fire to heaven to consume the sacrifice, but then the rain comes. I stopped the rains, and so did Elijah when he began the drought. I brought down fire and brimstone upon Sodom, and Elijah similarly brought down fire. Okay, it's another miracle story we passed over where Elijah incinerates some soldiers that were sent to capture him. I think it's a total of over 100 soldiers. He lived and will go on living until the revival of the dead. Okay, it's a typical rabbinic statement. Elijah has not died. He lived and he's still alive up in heaven, and he will come down. I just want to begin with the first passage of Kabbalah for the moment. And the Kabbalah, many of you know what the Kabbalah is. If those of you who don't, it's basically the mystical dimension of Judaism, the mystical interpretation of the Torah. Literally, it means tradition or that which has been received. And the main book of the Kabbalah, of course, is the Zohar. So when we're moving into the Kabbalah, we're we're really moving, from the Bible to rabbinic literature, and this next stage is the Kabbalah. So Elijah is significant in the Talmud of the Midrash. He's become central in certain parts of the Kabbalah. Why? Because he is the one who brings inspiration. Elijah, you remember, is linked with the Ruach, with the spirit, right? One of King Ahab's servants says, the wind will the Ruach will carry you off to I know not where. Okay, the Spirit of God will take you away. Elijah is transported by the Spirit. He's filled with the Spirit. He's inspired by the Spirit, and he himself learns how to inspire others. This is one important transformation that happens. In the Bible, he is the prophet. He is the one who's filled with the Word of God, with the Spirit of God. But in the Talmud and the Midrash, and more so in the Kabbalah, Elijah becomes the one who can inspire others, who can convey the Holy Spirit. He really is the embodiment of the Holy Spirit. That's one way to think of Elijah. He conveys it, he embodies it, and that is really part of his greatness. Look at this line at the beginning of the section here on Kabbalah. This is from Louis Ginsburg, a great scholar of Rabbinic Judaism. I'll go down to the footnote to show you his name. Louis Ginsburg, one of the great scholars of the Talmud and the Midrash in the 20th century. This is what he said: what Moses was to the Torah, Elijah was to the Kabbalah. He had maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but what he means is inspiration. Elijah inspired mystics to create. And just take an example here from this story in the Talmud. A story based on the Talmud. According to the Talmud, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Yochai, a great figure of the 2nd century, Rabbi Shimon, son of Yochai, hid in a cave for 12 years because of Roman persecution. He hid from the Romans for 12 years, along with his son, Rabbi Elazar. And the Talmud doesn't say too much about what happened to them. They were in the cave and studying Torah the whole time. At the end of that story in the Talmud, Elijah shows up. In the middle of that story of the Talmud, Elijah shows up and says, it's time for Rabbi Shimon to come out of the cave. Elijah has no direct contact with Rabbi Shimon, according to the basic story in the Talmud. Elijah hides in the cave. Rabbi Shimon hides in the cave for 12 years. Elijah comes and announces that Rabbi Shimon can now leave the cave. Okay, but there's no contact between Elijah and Rabbi Shimon. But when the Zohar retells that story here, it's on page 7, Elijah and the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon, son of Yochai, fled to the wilderness of Lida and hid in a cave, he and his son, Rabbi Elazar. A miracle was performed for them. A carob tree sprouted up and a spring of water gushed forth. They ate from that carob tree and drank from those waters. Elijah, gratefully remembered, visited them twice a day and taught them, and no one else knew. Okay, there's a small change here, but a significant change. The change is that Elijah visited them. Elijah doesn't just show up at the end of the story. Elijah comes to teach them Torah. Elijah inspired Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon is seen as the author of the Zohar, which means that Elijah inspired the Zohar. So that's why Elijah becomes so important in rabbinic literature and in Kabbalah, because he is the source of inspiration. Let's come to some question and discussion now.
Sure.
Ari may have one or two of his own.
I've been reading the stuff, so let's get through a few of these. I think you and I were joking or saying if Elijah came, if certain historical figures came back and saw what people had made of them, they would be a little surprised. My feeling is if we could bring Elijah back, he would be a little bit confused when he read all this literature. But
yeah, well,
maybe it all happened as the rabbi said. I don't know. What do I know? I'm not a. So here's a few questions. So in the Talmud, I think the word used when the rabbis can't decide and they say that Elijah will decide, is it teko? Teko?
Yes, that's very interesting. The term is teku, taf yud kuf vav. You could spell it Teiqu, teku. Really what that means is let it stand. It's from the root kum. It's like takum. Let it stand. In other words, the argument is happening and the rabbis can't come to a decision. Let it stand. We don't know what's going to happen.
Isn't it an acronym
But
for Tishbi Yitaret?
it's later understood as an acronym, Tishbi Yitaretz, the Tishbite, right? Eliyahu was called Eliyahu at Tishbi from that little town of Tishbe, perhaps in the Transjordan. Elijah the Tishbite, so here we just Teku, okay, Tishbi, the next letter is Yud, Yitaretz, he'll answer Kushiot Uba'ayot, contradictions and problems. Elijah will solve everything. Elijah will solve all the problems. So the Talmud just means let it stand, but later it's understood to mean Elijah will come and answer all the difficulties. Yeah.
So it ties into one of the aspects you talked about. One of the stories or types of Elijah stories you didn't mention was Elijah as a beggar and a poor person that you run into. I know that when I was at school, and people have brought it up in their own story, that it was often taught to kids, and that's why you take care and you make sure you are very nice to beggars, because you never know, it could be Elijah. So, but you didn't mention that story. Is that because it's not, is that a more modern story of Elijah, or is that in rabbinic literature as well?
I mean, yeah, it's interesting. You know, Elijah, first of all, Elijah is the most popular figure in all of Jewish folklore, right? There are more stories about, you know, there's an institute in Israel. I think I mentioned this too last time in Haifa and Mount Carmel. There's an institute to gather all of the stories of Jewish folklore, either in writing or on tape recordings. So of those stories, there are more Elijah stories than for King David, Abraham, Moses, Sarah, Rachel, any biblical figure by far. So he's the most popular figure, which means you have hundreds and hundreds of stories, thousands and thousands of Elijah stories. The more recent ones, by recent I mean, you know, maybe after the 10th century, the more recent ones, you may find more of that. In the Talmud and the Midrash, you have a lot of stories. Sometimes he'll appear as a beggar. Basically, he can take on, you know, so many different shapes. I would say what's common is that he's very often an old man, but whether he's wealthy or poor just depends on the situation. He may want to teach something by being a beggar. He may want to teach something by being wealthy. So in the Talmud, you have some stories of him. It's more that he comes to help people who are beggars. He will give a beggar something miraculous. Like, I don't remember offhand if he appears as a beggar in the Talmud, but later in the medieval stories, much more commonly. And in the Talmud, usually he encounters rabbis and surprises them, answering their questions or giving them gifts. Sometimes he's impatient. He's also known for his impatience.
Howard asks, you didn't mention the story of the oven of Aknai. Obviously, you can't get to every story, but wants to know your thoughts on that and how Elijah, what role he's playing there as well. It's probably, well, you tell us.
That's a remarkable story. Since you mentioned it, let me read it to you. I have it in the book, of course, and it is remarkable. See if I can find it. Here we go. It's a very important story, even though Elijah doesn't appear until late in it. I want to read it because it's so revealing about what the rabbis are up to when they try to determine the meaning of Torah. It has been taught. Basically, the context is in the Rabbinic Academy, in the Beit Midrash, there's an argument going on between Rabbi Eliezer and the other rabbis. Rabbi Eliezer says, I think the law is this way, and the other rabbis don't agree with him, and they vote, and the majority is against Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, I'm not even going to go into the exact detail now. It's an oven. Whether a certain kind of oven is ritually pure or impure, you can look it up yourself in the Talmud. In my book, it's on page 66. So Rabbi Eliezer has lost the argument, but he refuses to give up. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha, okay, if the legal decision is as I say, let this carob tree prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place and it moved a distance of 100 cubits. Some say 400 cubits. Okay, so he's proved miraculously that he is correct. He says, if I'm right, let the tree be uprooted. It's uprooted. The rabbi said, one does not bring proof from a carob tree. That's not allowed. We're here to have a halachic discussion. We don't deal with supernatural elements. The carob tree returned to its place. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is as I say, let the aqueduct prove it. The water in the aqueduct flowed backwards. They responded, one does not bring proof from water. The water returned to its place. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is as I say, let the walls of the academy prove it. The walls of the academy inclined and were about to fall. Rabbi Yoshua rebuked them, saying, when scholars grapple with one another in a halachic dispute, what does it have to do with you? It has been taught, the walls did not fall in deference to Rabbi Yoshua, and they did not stand upright in deference to Rabbi Eliezer. They still remain inclined. Okay, this is like the leaning tower of Pisa. This is the leaning walls of the Beit Midrash. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is as I say, let it be proved from heaven. Okay, now Eliezer wants a direct proof from God that he's right. A heavenly voice issued, saying, what do you have against Rabbi Eliezer, since the halacha agrees with him everywhere? Rabbi Yoshua arose and said, it is not in heaven. Quoting from the Torah, Lo vashamayim hi. It's not in heaven. What does this mean? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, one pays no attention to a heavenly voice, since God has already given the Torah to us on Mount Sinai, and it's written, follow the majority. Okay, God has given the Torah, so now it's up to people to decide. It's out of God's hands. Even a miracle won't interfere with the rabbinic discussion. Now comes Elijah, finally. Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah. Okay, this is somewhat afterward. Later that day, the next day, this is a later figure. Long later, Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah and asked him, what did the Blessed Holy One do at that moment? Okay, how did God react? The rabbis are saying, basically, we don't need God. We have the Torah. We'll determine what it means. It's out of God's hands. So how did God respond? God replied, according to Rabbi Natan, according to Elijah, God laughed and smiled and said, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. An amazing story. One of the most remarkable stories in the Talmud. God loses out to the rabbis. The rabbis now control, the rabbis now decide how to live a holy life. They're not interested in supernatural events. It's a remarkable story. It shows you how powerful the rabbinic undertaking was. But the reason I read that story, the reason Ari asked about it, is that Elijah is the one who tells us what God felt, what God thought. We wouldn't know about God's reaction, right? Their reaction, my children have defeated me. In Hebrew, just two words, nitzchuni banai. My children have defeated me. We wouldn't know that God said that God thought that, if it weren't for Elijah. So it's another example of Elijah conveying divine information, heavenly information to people on earth.
Thank you. That was Howard's question. He gets the credit. And the question that came up earlier in the discussion and that I wanted to bring up is, we've discussed the role of Elijah in the Jewish tradition. You mentioned Elijah plays a role in Christianity and in Islam. Does Elijah have any role in like the future in Christianity or in Islam, like he has in Judaism, where he will come and announce the Mashiach, or does he have a minor role in the other traditions?
Okay, in Islam, the figure is Al-Khidr, right? The green one. And he is prominent in Islam. He really fulfills the identical role that Elijah filled for the Kabbalists. Elijah inspired the Kabbalists, and Al-Khidr inspired the Sufis. In fact, at the same time, and in the same general geographical area, we know that Ibn Arabi, one of the most famous of all the Sufis, he didn't admit that he was a Sufi, but the Sufis claim him. Ibn Arabi, the great Islamic philosopher and mystic, Ibn Arabi describes being given the mantle of Al-Khidr, right? Like Alicia has the mantle of Elijah, and Ibn Arabi received the mantle of inspiration from Al-Khidr. So it's exactly the same there in Islam. And Christianity, it's it's more complicated, but because Christianity values the Hebrew Bible, Elijah is there to begin with, and Elijah is so prominent in announcing the coming According to some traditions, Elijah will still play a role in Messianic time, because you could say Elijah has been displaced by Jesus, but he still fulfills a role announcing Jesus' coming as John the Baptist. Maybe it's who Elijah thought of himself as to begin with, and then in some accounts he reappears later too.
And why in Islam is he referred to as the green one?
The green one, this goes back long before Islam, and you find this cross-culturally, the green man. He's another figure like the shapeshifter, but much more widespread. Somehow a tree who turns into a human, a tree who can move around. You have these tales and legends all over the world about nature coming alive, sometimes described as a green human-like figure. In Islam, that becomes combined with Elijah legends. So the one who's called the green one inherits some qualities from this cross-cultural theme of the green man, but other qualities inherits from Elijah directly. Sometimes Al-Khidr and Elijah are identified. Sometimes they're seen as cousins or brothers. There's one beautiful account that Elijah will meet Al-Khidr in Jerusalem, and together they'll go on Hajj to Mecca. They'll go on pilgrimage to Mecca. And there's some Jews in Islamic countries who call Elijah Al-Khidr, who call Elijah the green one, because they're Muslims who are venerating the green one. I want to take one question from my old high school buddy Neil Eisenberg, who's now involved in CSP and Ari's program, Community Scholar Program. I want to read this from Neil. We usually think of God as being all-knowing, yet Elijah seems to puzzle, amuse, annoy, and instruct God. God seems to evolve in his divine role partly through Elijah. Perhaps that partially explains his enduring popularity, shows the potential of being a human. Even we can, in theory, influence God. Very interesting. It reminds me of how in high school, Neil would say something in class and we'd all pause and think about it a little bit. Elijah is remarkable, right? Because he's filled with the divine. He can convey divine energy, but he's so human. He's still human. That's, again, he's the virtuoso of the in-between. In a way, he's become a divine-like figure. Okay, he's become an angel, you might say. He is angelic, but he's not like other angels. Okay, he can get upset. He can decide to do things on his own. He's not totally controlled by the divine directive. He can express his own unique quality. There's something, as I said, he's something of a trickster too, and he can be impatient. Okay, there's one rabbi who comes to him and one rabbi who's visited by Elijah. At a certain point, Elijah stops visiting him because the rabbi criticized Elijah. And then the rabbi says, "Why didn't you come visit me?" And Elijah says, I didn't come visit you because you insulted me. And the rabbi says, "Look, I said you're impatient, and you're showing us right now you are impatient." So the rabbis are willing sometimes to criticize him, as we've seen, and that is part of his unique beauty, I think, Elijah, that he spans the human and the divine. As to having an effect on God, that's remarkable too, and that you could say is one of the main contributions of the Kabbalah, to say not only does God help us, we help God. God needs our help. You find this already, you could say hinted at in the Bible and mentioned occasionally in rabbinic literature, but in the Kabbalah it becomes a major theme that God needs us. That, in fact, is the phrase tzorech gavoa, the need on high. God needs us, and Elijah is part of that as well.
Let's finish up with just a question about the book. So, I mean, it's not a big book. I don't have it with me. I have it home. So, how long did it take you to write the book? And did you have challenges to what stories and what you were going to include versus what you had to leave out?
Yeah, it's a real problem with Elijah that there's so many good stories, and I didn't want the book just to be an anthology. The book, I think it took me about 5 years. I would say I read for 2 years, and I wrote for 1.5 years, and I went through the whole editing, publishing process for about 1.5 years. I think it was about 5 years. And many stories I had to leave out. And one one about Rabbi Akiva that's not in the book. Let me just mention it's very simple, very short. Rabbi Akiva, as you know, according to legend, came from a family of he converted, or his family had converted, his ancestors had converted, and he knew nothing of Hebrew. He couldn't read Hebrew. When he was 40 years old, he began studying and became a tremendous scholar. But at an early point, he's married to the daughter of a wealthy landowner, and the woman's father wants nothing to do with Akiva and disowns his daughter. So Rabbi Akiva and his wife Rachel have to live in total poverty. They don't even have a bed. They're just lying on straw. They're sleeping in the barn on straw. And Elijah shows up. Elijah shows up and says, here Elijah really is the beggar. Elijah shows up and says, I need some straw, because I think he's talking about his wife or another woman. I think my wife has given birth, and we need a bed. So then Rabbi Akiva's wife, Rachel, says, look, there are people who are even worse off than we are. We have straw. They don't even have a straw. And at that point, she enables Akiva to go and become a great Torah scholar, because she feels, I'll let my husband go. We're not as bad off as some other people are. So you could say that's Elijah enabling Rabbi Akiva to become the great founder of Rabbinic Judaism that he became.
Thank you. Okay, so next week is the end of the trilogy, and we're going to focus on, is it all about Elijah and Kabbalah?
It'll be Elijah and Kabbalah, and then the Seder and Havdalah.
By the way, I announced it at our minyan we have a coastal minyan that meets once a month, and I always like to tell people when Pesach is coming. So I first said, Rosh Hashanah is coming up late this year, everybody. It's September. And if you're counting, it's 8 months till Pesach. So Ahuva, 8 months to Pesach. We're going to get ready next week. Yes. And don't clean your house yet. I wouldn't clean the house, but you'll maybe appreciate more about why Elijah is coming to our Seder. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Good. Shalom.
Have a great day, everybody. Keep safe. See you all. I'll be away next week, but we have great programs and we have guest hosts, so don't worry. Take care. If you see me in Boston, it's me. I'll be running around, maybe Cape Cod. But Deb Schubach, I need some good weather. I checked the weather in Boston. It does not look like we're going to have sun every day. I know you need water, but I don't want the water. You can have it today. You can have it now. You can have it when I leave. Okay, Jennifer Malvin, good to see you. Take care, everybody. Gotta run. Bye.